Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Theory from the Margins Consortium. We deep read on current scholarship on post-colonial theory, the decolonial turn, and theory building from the global south. And today we are delighted to welcome Professor Mignolo. Um, Professor Walter Mignolo is the William H. Wanamaker Professor and Director of the Center for Global Studies and the Humanities at Duke University. He was associate researcher at Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Quito between 2002 and 18, and an honorary research associate for Center for Indian Studies in South Africa, Wits University at Johannesburg between 2015 and 2019. He's a senior advisor of Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute based in Berlin, and he received a Doctor Honoris Causa degree from the University Nacional of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Among his books related to the topic are The Darker Side of the Renaissance, Literacy, Territoriality, and Colonization in 95, Delinking, The Rhetoric of Modernity, The Logic of Coloniality, and the Grammar of Decoloniality in 2007, Local Histories, Global Designs, Coloniality, Subaltern Knowledges, and Border Thinking in 2000, The Idea of Latin America in 2006, On Decoloniality, Concepts, Analysis, Praxis, co-authored with Catherine Walsh in 2018, and the forthcoming The Politics of Decolonial Investigations from Duke University Press in 2021. So in this Theory of the Margins from the Margins event, we discussed two works published and forthcoming by philosopher and semiotician Professor Mignolo, one of the world's foremost thinkers on epistemic decolonization and one of the founders of the Modernity coloniality school of thought. In On Decoloniality, Professor Mignolo and Catherine Walsh explore the hidden forces of the colonial matrix of power, its origination, transformation, and current presence, while asking the crucial questions of decoloniality's how, what, why, with whom, and what for. In The Politics of Decolonial Investigations, which is forthcoming, Professor Mignolo provides a sweeping examination of how coloniality has operated around the world in its myriad forms between the 16th and 21st centuries. So without any further delay, please let me present Professor Mignolo. The floor is yours, Professor.
There. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mamita and Body and all the people who organize Theory in the Margin and have invited me. That is terrific. I'd like to talk about these questions about coloniality, decoloniality, so thank you very much. And I like that introduction, Mamita, but I have to say that all the books and titles you read is exactly the same book. It's just one book in different kind of form, right? Um, I never sat to write the book. It's just you do, you think and you do research, and all of a sudden you realize that you have a book. So that is the story. It's one book, uh, 20, 30 years expansion, right? So I will then use those 20 minutes you gave me. The first 10 minutes, I will make a kind of a brief summary of On Decoloniality, and the second 10 minutes on the politics of decolonial investigation. So, On Decoloniality, concepts, analytics, practice, co-written with Catherine Walsh. Catherine Walsh is one of the members of the Modernity coloniality group. And she had been, and I have been working with her for 20 years. We started working together in the 2000, something like that. So what the book is, being the first book of On Decoloniality book series, is an update of this kind of decolonial school of thought, if we can put it that way, that was initiated by Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist. But more than a professor at the university, Quijano was an activist, an intellectual who was in the fight for against development in the 70s, the 80s, etc. And he came up with the concept of coloniality at the end of the Cold War. That's 91, something like that. Uh, and about 8 years later, many people who had been reading Quijano and thinking coloniality, uh, we came together in one conference of the International Sociological Association. Not all, but five of us: Lander, Coronil, Quijano himself, Dussel, myself. And all of a sudden, kind of, we generated a kind of the working group, and the working group began to grow. So that was 98. So in 22 years, there is a lot of people working. The founders, but also the core group around the three founders, but also now there is a lot of the younger generation that are in Europe, in former Eastern Europe, Russia, South Africa, etc., etc. So basically, the book has two parts. Catherine works more in direct contact with indigenous and Afro South American organization and intellectuals. And I am here and I work more in a kind of a theoretical aspect. So my part of the book was an attempt to present a basic summary of the main concept and concern that the group elaborated in those 20 years. Of course, it's my version, it's my responsibility. A lot of them are my concept, but at the same time, I couldn't have done that without working with 10, 15 people for 20 years. So, the basic for those of you who are not familiar with this school of thought is the following. Number one, coloniality is a concept that did not exist. Colonialism, yes, but not coloniality. So, coloniality is a concept that emerged in the third world, just at the margin of at the moment, in the third world kind of disappeared because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Uh, It's not a European concept. Why? Because Europe didn't need coloniality. It's not a US concept because in the US mainly the mainstream research in United States didn't need coloniality. The North Atlantic didn't need coloniality. They didn't see it. They saw modernity. And they thought that modernity was the totality. But when you are in the margin, to be coherent with your project, what you feel, not just see, but what you feel is something else. You feel colonialism, of course, but then one day you realize that behind colonialism there is a logic that is a global logic of coloniality. And that global logic, you can make colonialism, you can make a distinction between Spanish colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, Dutch colonialism, British, French, and United States colonialists without settler colonies. But coloniality is the underlying logic of all those Atlantic colonialism. We're not talking about Roman colonialism. Or if you wanna, some people talk about Chinese colonialism, 3 or 4 centuries BC, etc., or after. So coloniality kind of set the frame for what happened in the world order we are living it today from 1500 to 2000. And then I will tell you why 2000, what happened after 2000. So basically, the basic idea, the founding idea of the group is that there is no modernity without coloniality, that they go together. So modernity is not a kind of ontological unfolding period of universal history. Is how certain people who were in the driving seat told the story about that world order, and the name of Renaissance and modernity kind of encapsulated that kind of moment in which Europe, that was a non-civilization, was just a bunch of Western Christians who lost the crusade, and they were trying to rebuild themselves, and all of a sudden they landed in what they call the New World, and that produced a significant revolution. We can talk about the colonial revolution. Carl Schmitt talked about the second nomos of the earth, and the second nomos of the earth was that moment. So before that, things were different in the sense that what he called the first nomos, we can say that there were many first nomos, what we call culture or civilization, but was a polycentric world order. No one civilization dominated, controlled, managed the other. 1500, one civilization, the youngest, because Western civilization didn't start in Greece, it started in the Renaissance, telling the story in retrospect and inventing the ancestrality, which is Greece and Rome. So, and that was kind of the foundation, the basic foundation of the world order, the modern colonial world order, in which we are still living. So that's the kind of the colonial revolution. That's what he called the second nomos of the earth, Schmidt. And with Quijano, Quijano himself introduced the concept of colonial matrix of power, when in Spanish is patron or pattern, and in English became matrix of power. And the difference between Quijano and Schmidt is Schmidt tell half of the story. Uh, Schmidt cannot see the other side. So, but Quijano tells the full story and tell how that kind of modernity managed to tell beautiful stories of salvation, progress, civilization, development at the cost of coloniality. So coloniality become the central piece of coloniality of power, or colonial matrix of power. Uh, so that is what defines the concept of coloniality and decoloniality as we, the group, the school of thought about it and practice it. Um, we are not saying that this is the way to think and do the colonial work. This is the way we do it. We are not saying, I mean, because there's a lot of critique that, we are kind of representing the Indian or represent. No, we are not representing anybody. We can have nothing to say to the indigenous people. They have a lot to tell to us, and we are learning from them. But they have their own concept and need of how to think colonialism, decoloniality, etc. And if just talk about the America, the same for the African diaspora. In South America and the Caribbean, they have a different normative grounding. They experienced coloniality, what we call coloniality, in a different way. So the question is, how do we work together? And we are working together. Sylvia Winter is quoting us. We are quoting Sylvia Winter. Wanakuni Mamani is quoting us. So, and we are in conversation with the Caribbean and with indigenous people, including indigenous people in Canada. That is what we talk about pluriversality. Pluriversality is precisely that. We assume, I assume that we have our truth. That's what we live. So sorry, but I believe that. But that truth is in parentheses, meaning this is my truth, and I know that you have your truth. That decolonization, decoloniality for you is different. And in front of us, we have the people who believe in truth without parentheses. And the truth without parentheses is war, is killing, is the politic of friend and enemy that Schmidt also kind of articulated politically in 1932 and Hitler assumed in 1933. So the political for him was uh, was the confrontation between friends and enemy. Decolonial politics is coalition, it's not enemy. Coalition in front of an of a force that is trying to prevent us to live and think the way we like to think and live. So coalition is fundamental to understand pluriversality. But to close this section and move to the second. So if modernity there is no modernity without coloniality, that is a kind of theoretical concept. Modernity, coloniality engenders, provoke decoloniality. So decoloniality is the response to modernity, coloniality. And modernity is a rhetoric of salvation, of progress, everything, happiness, consume, etc. And coloniality are the consequences we have to pay to carry on the dreams of modernity. Fortunately, a lot of people now, I mean, for 500 years, not everybody swallowed that narrative, but there were kind of small groups and the conditions were different. But now there is a kind of awakening, planetary awakening. Why? Because of a student of mine, Samantha Fong from Singapore in the Divinity School. In a final paper about this, she kind of said it in a way that is always in my mind. It's a perfect formulation. She said, colonialism is over, but coloniality is not over, it's all over. And because coloniality is all over, but people experience coloniality differently. One thing is how we experience, and many ways in the Americas. The other thing is how, I mean, the Dutch were in South Africa in 1652, and then the British. There is the Dutch and the British were in South India and South Asia and Southeast Asia with the since 1600 with the East Indian Company, the British East Indian Company, and the Dutch East Indian Company. So people have different. What we share is the experience of coloniality. But how we experience locally is different. What are the stories we told, etc., etc. And that I think is for me is if we survive in this planet today, I think is a bright situation now. And that bright situation I call the third nomos of the earth, and that is the book about. The next book is about the third nomos of the earth. So I take the formula from Smith. Smith talk about the new nomos, but he talked about the new nomos because he saw the new nomos in the linear history, in the linear universal Hegelian line of history. I call the third nomos, not the new nomos, because the third nomos is pluriversal. The third nomos doesn't have one design. And that is one of the differences we have more Marxists, because Marxists would like to have the kind of their design that is different from liberal and neoliberal, but is within the logic of enlightenment. So we are kind of getting out of the logic of the Enlightenment. We start from some place else. We don't start from Europe. We cannot get, I mean, we have to recognize that Europe is all over the place. Modernity have made a significant contribution to planetary civilization, but what cannot admit is the aberration. And the aberration of modernity is to pretend that they have the model, the planetary model for the happiness of everybody else. And we say thank you, but no. Uh, thank you for the invitation. But as Groucho Marx used to say, I don't want to be a member of a club that want me to be a member. So I I moved to my second to the book in relation to that. So it's a continuation of this. Let me share the screen if I can. Well, we take 30 seconds of breathing room here. I am sharing or not yet? Not yet. So let me see. Oh, here. Okay. What about that? It's not there, it's not there yet? Now, okay. So, the this book, The Politic of the Colonial Investigation, let me just mention two, three basic attempt. Number one is the fourth volume is of a tetralogy, which is The Darker Side of Renaissance, The Local History, uh, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, and this one. So in a way, it's a kind of capitalizing on 30 on 30 years of research in a kind of refreshing and updating the orientation. So I mentioned the colonial metric of power, and I will tell you a little bit more about what the colonial metric of power is. Metaphorically, pedagogically, metaphorically, is like the unconscious in psychoanalysis. In Freud and Lacan, what analysts do, think about the unconscious beyond the practice. So metaphorically, the colonial metric of power is the unconscious of Western civilization. Is the underlying structure of Western civilization. It's a big claim, well, but that is where we see it. Now, the other important things about this manuscript, I mean, the intent, I don't know if the manuscript is important or not, but the important thing in writing the manuscript, writing the book, is to think about why do we do what we do. We are at the university working with people in the museum, but also journalists. Uh, every kind of discipline or area in the sphere of knowledge has to do investigation. And I take investigation from Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes did investigation to solve certain problems. So what are the problems we want to solve? So what we want to know? So we want to know how the colonial measure of power work because we want to liberate from it. So you don't want to you don't want to exercise, perform decoloniality if you don't know how coloniality works on you. So the basic question here I am always ask and tell to start thinking decolonially, start thinking about where do you feel coloniality in you? Where is coloniality touching you? Where do you see coloniality around you, at the university, in the street, in the advertising, in the social media, in television? That is the beginning. That is the beginning that you began to become aware and began to reflect on how coloniality is touching you. So investigation is a second order narrative. This is what is, that is why I didn't feel good because of that. So I want to know more about these things that makes me not feel good in relation to a lot of people who do feel good. Yeah? They are kind of very comfortable what they are doing, and I am not. So if I didn't feel that discomfort at a certain point, I won't be here. But I didn't know why I didn't fit in many situations. To make a long story short, because I am son of immigrant, and being a son of immigrant in Argentina, well, my grandfathers came from Italy, but I mean, you belong to the community of immigrant. You have an immigrant consciousness. You don't belong. You don't belong to a country that says that you have to respect the national anthem, the flag, the national history, etc. But that's not my, etc., etc., etc. So I didn't know until I discovered coloniality. When I discovered the concept of coloniality in 95, 94 and 95, 4 or 5 years after Quijano introduced, that was a shock. Was a shock, but everything makes sense. Was an epiphany. That is what happened to me. So, and that was a tremendous sensation of empowerment because I began. So, the darker side of the Renaissance is an autobiographical investigation. It's an investigation that kind of explain the history of Latin America, myself in relation to Europe, but in relation to the world. So, so that is why the politic of the colonial investigation. What do we want to know? Why? Why do we need this, etc., etc.? And basically, is that the macro history of the narrative of the 500 years was still uncontrolled by Europe and European. So we need investigation to tell our story of those 500 years. But our story, mine is one, because I come from the history of the Americas. Well, people from India have a different relation to Europe, different local history. So that is why we don't have the kind of the magic formula of decolonial. That is the way we do it. Uh, like it or not, that is the way we do it, and we feel good about doing what we are doing, and that is, we don't want, I mean, one chapter of the book of On Decoloniality is decoloniality is not a mission, it's an option. We are not going around the world to convert people, to lobby people who don't want to be converted, right? Why would we not convert people that? So we put an option, and whoever would like to take it or already took it from a different perspective, then is when we start kind of the conversation. Conversation and coalition are the practical aspects of decoloniality. We do investigation, we write or give talk like this, but the question is to open up a sphere of conversation to establish coalition and advance pluriversality. So briefly, give me 5 minutes more. So the colonial mixture of power. So this is not a cookie cutter. Uh, this is just a map. It's not, it's not something that we apply. Application is a very modern concept. You have a theory and then you apply it. No, this is a map. And why maps? Why you need map? Well, you go to a city that you don't know, and you go to the hotel and say, you have a map of the city. Uh, and then you look at the map and he said, well, the museum is here, the football stadium is here, etc. The mall is here. Uh, and then you start walking or take a taxi or whatever. So the map begins to kind of take corporality. There are restaurants and people, etc., etc. So the initial map that you get at the hotel is there just as a guide, but what you do in the city is very different. So the same here. So this is a map, is a guide. So the colonial measure of power consists in four domains. The domain of knowledge and understanding, governance, authority, who control the authority, the economy, and the concept of human and humanity. That is very crucial because that is what controls sexes and races. Human is not the humanness of people who start kind of walking into extremities and using their hands millions of years ago. No, the human is the Western concept, Renaissance concept of human and humanity. So that is a sphere or a sphere. So why do we get to these four domains? Well, because the discourse of modernity is what kind of underline. So it's not reality, but how modernity make us to see reality. Hmm? So knowledge and understanding it's not the knowledge of the countryman or whatever. It's institutional knowledge. It's theological knowledge, and it's the theology, the kind of the church theology, the university, and the museum. Those are the three major institutions that control knowledge in the colonial mixture of power. It's not they are the only one who produce knowledge, are the only one who control knowledge and tell you how to know. To get a PhD, you have to respect the way of knowing of the discipline you are. You cannot just think, you can think freely, but if you want a piece of paper, you have to kind of respect what the institution said. And those of you who had or have an advisor will know about that, right? The kind of so governance. Governance is well, I mean, every kind of community kind of have some kind of organization, be it small or large. But the governance of the colonial measure of power are mainly two main structures. The monarchic state, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and the nation state that replaces the monarchic state. Still somebody has the monarch inside, like Spain and UK and Netherlands. But the nation state is the new form of governance that is almost global today. There are a couple of monarchic states in the in the Middle East, but the nation state and the nation state is like it or not, that's what it is. Uh, then economy. Economy, every kind of organization have an economy. An economy is the administration of scarcity. That is the concept, Greek concept of oikos, oikos. Oikos was the administration of the household. And the household was not just papa, mother, son, or daughter, and mother. The household was kind of the extended family, like the IU in the Andes. The IU or the Altepetel in the Aztec is the equivalent of the oikos. So from the oikos came oikonomies. But by the 16th century, a oikonomy changed meaning. and was no longer administration of a scarcity for survival, but was a kind of the rule of increasing wealth. And that is why Adam Smith, two, 200 and a half years after the so-called discoveries of America, wrote The Wealth of the Nations. Right? So there is no political economy among the Greeks. Political economy is a modern colonial European invention. And then you have human and humanity, and human and humanity is the self definition of an elite which was were in Europe, they were European, they were male, basically male, there were no women here, and they were, of course, Christian and white. And they said that they were heterosexual, because at that point, if you were not heterosexual, you didn't say it, because still the church has some kind of control there. Huh? But this is, so those are the kind of the four sphere, but underneath the sphere, underneath that sphere, is the level of the enunciation. And the level of the enunciation is what control the four domain and control the flows that you see in the arrows. Huh? So you cannot understand any domain of the colonial matrix of power or understand the enunciation without making connection, interrelation with the other domains. So that is a very simplistic explanation. And give me two more minutes. So this is the constitution of the colonial matrix of power. But there is a simultaneous movement. The constitution is at the same time destitution. It constitutes itself by destituting. So what destitute is everything else. I mean, other knowledge, other form of governance, other kind of concept of labor, etc., etc. And what we are now today is in the reconstitution. So the decolonial is the reconstitution of the destituted. And that is basically the argument. And the, the reconstitution of the destituted, who is coming from all over the planet, is engendering the third nomos of the earth. So when people say that this is a crisis of Western civilization, this is precisely what it is. Because Western civilization cannot solve the problem that Western civilization created. So the question comes now from, I mean, from the non-European world, but also from in Europe, the importance of immigrants in Europe and immigrants in United States. So each nation state in Europe today is becoming more and more plurinational. United States is a plurinational state already, but it's difficult to recognize officially. So that is part of the third nomos of the earth, not just what happened around the planet, but what happened at the heart of coloniality, which is basically Western Europe, not Eastern Europe, Western Europe and United States. Okay, I stop there.
Professor, could I please remind you to charge your computer? We can see that it is 10% and it might just...
Right.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Mignolo, for that fantastic introduction to your books and your ideas. I'm going to start today's panel discussion with Dr. Cecilia Salinas. She is a doctor in social anthropology and an artist. She is part of a decolonial thinking collective with 4 other Latin American anthropologists, Maria Guzman, Monica Amador, Astrid Stensrud, and Mario Blaser. So Please, Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I would say first, thank you to Theory from the Margins for this invitation to participate in this discussion. And thank you, y muchísimas gracias, Walter Mignolo, for so generous sharing your thoughts, your engagement with us. And what?
Give me a minute, but because I'm running out of gasoline and I
Yes.
have the plug.
Yes, okay. Cecilia, do you want to tell us a little bit about your reading group while we wait?
Yes, we started in I think was March or April 2017 at the social anthropology department of at the University of Oslo, and we did it for almost 2 years there, and then we went digital, and we have been meeting since then once a month to and we read together and discuss different texts and also our texts think together, and so it's really a rewarding space of development, and it's really great.
Yes. So would you like to continue with your question? I think we're all here now.
Walter,
Cecilia?
yes.
But you didn't read the question yet, right?
No. And I want to say thank you. I read the text Decolonial Investigations on the Politics of Eurocentric Knowing, Sensing, and Believing. And it engaged me. I like it very much because it engaged me not only at the academic level, but also at the existential level. And I am delighted that this ongoing work goes deeply into the question of epistemic and as the aesthesis reconstitution. And I have a lot of questions, but I have time to ask one question only. So you're right that the Anishinaabe researchers engage in a process of returning to themselves, that is, evaluating how they personally have been affected by colonization, reading themselves of the emotional and psychological baggage they carry from this, and returning to ancestral traditions, that is, recreating the cultural and political flourishment of the past to support the well-being of the contemporary citizens. And as I read you, you seem to argue that one of the ways for reconstitution is achieved through reclaiming tradition. So, and I understand that a tradition is dynamic, it's not frozen in time, but how do we reclaim traditions in situations that these have been destroyed or not passed through, in contexts where the cultural references have been deleted slowly through several generations? So to refer to your language as well, how do we heal? How do we go about this?
Okay, so shall I go one to one, or you want to? Yeah, okay. Um, so yeah, that's what I call reconstitution. So with the Anishinaabe, but also I am working with Fernando Wanakuni Mamani in Bolivia. And that's what they are doing. They are kind of reconstituting something that was, I mean, that metaphor of epistemic genocide, that is a very superficial and misleading because ideas, you cannot kill ideas. You cannot kill way of being and thinking unless you kill everybody who kind of have this way of thinking. So for 500 years, the Anishinaabe and the Aymaras and others, they didn't lose their way of, they have always been living the way they were living, except that they have the settler in front of them. If that continuity was not there, they cannot be doing what they are doing now. So they are reconstituting something that was destituted but was not killed. And they are doing because they are doing it. So, well, what are you doing, settler, here in our land? Give me our land back. But to do that, you cannot just argue with the same argument of the settler. You have to reconstitute your knowledge. But you cannot talk to the settlers or the descendant of the settler, the Canada or Bolivia, in Aymara or Nishanabeg. You have to talk in English or French or in Spanish. So that is where border thinking is a very powerful situation and way of being, because it's the power of the enslaved person. The enslaved person knows his reason or her reason and the reason of the master. The master only knows the reason of the master because the slave has no reason. So that is what the Aymara and the Shanabeg, and that is what I am learning. I am not an indigenous. I am a son of an immigrant. So no, tradition is, of course, tradition is not something there that you dig, and it's the narrative you can build on something you may dig, let's say, a piece of archaeological piece. So, and the problem here is, I mean, not the problem, the question we have to deal here, that the Western has its own tradition, but they name it history and universal history. So the West they don't have to reconstitute the tradition, because we are in the situation we are because they enacted, they told that story and pretend that all of us kind of fold into that story. So basically, that is the question of reclaiming tradition, is the decolonial reconstitution. And I like was something that you said before, existential level. That's it. I mean, if the thing we investigate and said and the story we tell do not touch people existentially, well, we are not doing a good job. Because, I mean, I am doing that because I have been touched existentially by Ansaldúa or by Quijano. It was not an intellectual shock, it was a kind of existential shock. And then I use my mind to make sense of that shock.
Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn to one of our members of the Theory from the Margins Collective, Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay. He is an associate professor at the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. So please, Bodhi.
Thank you so much, Professor Mignolo, for this. This was, you know, I think the first work I read of yours was the idea of Latin America as an undergrad. We had
Wow.
kind of like this paper on global literatures, and we also had Marquez and Borges and so on in there. So we read some Latin American theory. That was how it was given to us, and I have loved your work since then, and I'm particularly also taken by the idea of pluriversality. And it's also one of the things that I kind of, so I run this project at the University of Oslo called Co-Futures, which is all about contemporary futurisms from the last couple of decades and how different kinds of worlds are imagined in new artistic movements, literary movements, and so on, primarily from the global south, but also marginalized cultures from the global north. And the question that I kind of wanted to ask you, and I only have time for one, is on that idea of futurisms, because you also mentioned Anishinaabe and Grace Dillon, who is Anishinaabe herself, also coined this term indigenous futurisms to refer to this kind of speculative worlds that are being built by indigenous communities. So I'm I'm kind of like interested to know that how would this imaginary of the future fit into decoloniality. So what would be the role of all these like new aesthetic movements? Because they're trying to grasp this space from, you know, Anglophone and colonial speculations. They're trying to take that space for the future back. So if I ask it differently, where lies the future of the many pluriversal futures? Thank you.
Okay, well, pluriversal future is what we are building, right? And that's, but thank you for that question because it allows me to add something to what I have been saying, and I didn't have time to say. The first thing is that we only live in the present. The future doesn't exist, and the past is gone. We live in a constant changing present. And the future will depend on what we do in the present, what decision we make in the present. So decoloniality, and connecting to Cecilia, the question is, what do we like to preserve in the present that has been destituted and we would like to see going forward toward the future? So I imagine that for indigenous people, that is a kind of what they would like to preserve in this present, and they are doing it, is their way of living, their knowledge, their language, their way of being in the world. So the future is, in a sense, in that sense, decoloniality is conservative. We like to preserve things that have been destituted in the name of change and progress and development. Don't tell me that stories anymore, please. I don't wanna be, decoloniality is a new solution. No, it's not new. Decoloniality is a need in the present to restitute what has been destituted. So that is the first point. The second point is that was in one of the questions that you sent me by writing. Who are the actors of decoloniality marching toward the future? The political society, and that I take the concept from Partha. Perhaps I give a different meaning, but I mean the general idea, I think he introduced it several years ago. So the political society, for those who are not familiar with Partha Chatterjee work, is a part of the civil society, to use the liberal configuration of civil society, state, and economy. Is the political society is the deformation of the civil society that can no longer be civil anymore. Because I mean, you saw in Europe, I mean, in Spain, that started many years ago, but in another part of the world, what happened there is that the middle class cannot longer be satisfied because they lost the privilege. So the revolution now is no longer the proletarian, it's everybody. And what we do as intellectual, artists, journalists, museum, etc., we are part of the political society. We are part of, that is a kind of the politic of decolonial investigation. Is the political society that needs that. Doesn't matter if they are professor at the university, has tenure, or they are intellectual, activists who needs argument, because you don't change that putting bombs. What is controlling us is certain form of knowledge that form subjectivity. We have to kind of reconstitute knowledge and subjectivity that have been destitute. So for the LGTB, for example, it's very important there. They are doing research to restitute a freedom of sexuality that has been controlled by gender, by the concept of gender. Or you can say, well, there are not just two genders, there are 10 genders, but don't tell me that there are two. So in order to do that, you don't put bomb. You need knowledge, and then you do exhibits, you do workshops, you do blogs, whatever. So there's a kind of proliferation. So the political society. Now, the third point I want to make is, and that is, what is the coloniality today in relation to decolonization during the Cold War? So we are no longer in the situation of Fanon. Fanon was in the middle of the thick. He was in Algeria. He was in other parts of Africa with Lumumba, with all the kind of the great intellectual, but also kind of leaders of the colonial movement to do what? To form the national state. Well, that is out of the question now. Because not only that we cannot kind of create nation states are all over, but we don't want either to have a nation state, because nation states are a problem, not the solution. And so the Zapatistas understood that, and they said, we don't want you to stay, you keep it. We have our own form of organization. So they call it whatever. Los Caracoles is a kind of their own form of government, of governance, right? So what I want to say here is that the political society is the decolonial mover toward pluriversality, toward coalition, toward living and acting the truth in parentheses, which also demolish the ego, the modern ego. This is my truth, right? Kind of masculinity and all this kind of stuff. But what we have to keep in mind here that now, and for the next 4 or 5 decades, there is a coexistence. I mean, let me go back quickly. Between 1500 and 2000, as I said, the second nomos, the colonial makeup of power, and westernization of the world. That was the period in which Europe westernized the world, and since 1950, the United States took over the driving seat. But in 2000, something began to happen. The West can no longer control the monster they created. So the most obvious was kind of the rise, the economic rise of China, that everybody was celebrating. So, oh, China is growing 10%, China is growing 9%, China is growing 11%. Fantastic. And all of a sudden, they began to realize that there were a lot of states that do not want to take order for the IMF, the European Central Bank, or the White House. A lot of states who said, this is capitalism, thank you for letting me know, now I kind of control it. So that is de-Westernization. And de-Westernization is capitalism, but it's not neoliberal. A lot of people confuse neoliberals with capitalism. Capitalism was always consumerist and production. The main politic of neoliberalism for me is the attempt to homogenize the world. And that was the driver of westernization, but it stopped. Iran don't want to be Western, China doesn't want to be Western, Russia doesn't want anymore. Turkey pretended, but they realized that no. And India, body, well, India was colonized by the British, and that is a heavy burden. So it depends. So that is the kind of de-Westernization is the state politics. So the best legacy of decolonization in the Cold War was de-Westernization. You see what I mean? So the political society, we don't have anything to do there. We can protest, we can do manifestation, and that's fine. But we have to do our own things. We cannot just resist. We have to re-exist. And re-exist means that we have to rebuild ourselves, whatever us is. Yeah? It's not our like me. It's us. So, but once the westernization began to be felt, what the West did was enter in a project of re-westernization. And that was Obama. Obama was the first step to re-westernize the world because they realized that Bush and Cheney, the United States and the West was losing hegemony. And they be restored to, in Gramscian terms, in Gramscian term, they move into domination. So you have Obama in Syria, initiating the war. You have Obama promoting Ukraine rebellion because they want to control the Central Asia. And then comes Trump, but it's the same process. I mean, he's a businessman, so want to control the world in a different way. So we are living into re-westernization that want to keep control of the colonial mixture of power, and de-westernization that is disputing the control. So the kind of the technological war, the commercial war, etc., is that China and India and not India, no, but Russia and Iran mainly are disputing the control of the colonial mixture of power. Decoloniality, the political society, is something else. And that is what we have to understand, that we live in nation state, but we have to build something else in whatever we are. No? So the Zapatistas, in that sense, of the peasant way. The peasant way, they are building their own kind of management of seed. They don't want a Monsanto to control it. But that is not the state. It's the peasant way organization. So we need to create, we have to work in the institution we have, museum, etc., newspaper, television, but we have to create our own kind of institution. So the Colonial Summer School, for example, is one example of kind of working on these ideas, building the communal in a small scale. So that is a pluriversal marching toward some kind of future. But the future now is, the future in the next decade is the coexistence between re-westernization, de-westernization, and decoloniality at large. It's no longer transition. This is an explosion. We have to think we are in a change of era. It's no longer an era of change, but we can add a post to solve any kind of problem.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I guess it's my turn now. I'm Momita. I work on politics and aesthetics at MF, the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society. I just wanted to ask you, Professor, to go back to what you call reconstitution in the epistemic order of knowing, sensing, and emoting. So I can see where the signposts are for the knowing bit. But I wonder, how do we unlearn in the sphere of the sensible, the aesthetic? Is this a radical redistribution of the sensible, or do we see a new way of being in this sensing and emoting space? How does one decolonize the senses?
Well, to decolonize the senses in the way you put it, you have to decolonize the knowledge that controls the senses. And the knowledge that controls the senses is aesthetics. And that I mean, it's mainly after the 18th century. So epistemology and aesthetics are the two main sphere of knowledge that control the senses, right? But those both are related to capital, to money. So the formula here is if you control if you control money, you control meaning. And that is you control meaning institutionally. So the second point here is to the link from aesthetics. So the aesthetic is the control of the taste, and mainly, and was articulated, Hegel articulated very clearly, aesthetic has to do with fine arts. And fine art is what European understood at that time for fine art, right? That, I mean, people in other parts of the world say, well, that's fine, but I mean, that is not my business. I mean, that's your problem. But they destituted other form of kind of sensibility in the creativity domain. Not only that, they use that to justify looting of pieces of non-European art. But non-European art was only for European, yeah? And they put it in the museum. So that is a kind of a few things of the perversity of aesthetics, as a kind of way of controlling knowledge and controlling sensibility. So what we are doing is kind of uncouple aesthetics from aesthesis. So aesthesis is sensing or emoting, and that is in everything we do. Aesthesis is not pegged to art. So art is, I mean, art, and that's another question. We have to kind of dismantle all these kind of things. Not a new definition of art. We decouple from art by understanding how the art, not what art is. That's it. That is not the decolonial question. That's the modern question. The decolonial question is when the concept of art came to be, where and why. So, and we realize that art pegged to aesthetic is just 18th century Europe. Art in Latin means ars, which is a skill. I mean, the shoemaker have a skill. But Aristotle also say, I mean, he talked about poetics, he didn't talk about aesthetics. What is the difference between a shoemaker and Sophocles? Because both are poiesis. Both are skill. The shoemaker makes fantastic shoes, and Sophocles makes fantastic narratives, right? So, but aesthesis is in everything we do. Mathematicians are not just brain. There is the emoting and the sensibility that kind of drive the way of doing mathematics. So then we have, look at this. We have art that is a skill, but in the 18th century, art is the work of genius. So aesthetic control the taste and decide who is a genius and who is not. And then you have the museum that kind of coronate the genius. And that is the destitution of human creativity and human thinking about their own creativity. So these are the kind of things we have to restitute, to marginalize, or not to marginalize, to put aesthetic and art related to aesthetic to its own place. They deserve to be where they are, thank you. But they don't deserve to be the kind of universal norm. So that is something that has to be done by investigation in the museum, in galleries, in everything that is institutionally related to art and aesthetics. So it's a double task in the institution that exists, but also create an institution. I mean, I have been involved with Alana Lokwar for 6 years until, unfortunately, she passed away. And Bebop was Black Europe Body Politics that she created in 2012. She's a kind of Afro-Dominican based in Berlin. And that was an institution that came out of the blue and conglomerated a lot of people, artists, intellectual, activists, black, yellow, green, gay, lesbian, heterosexual, etc., to talk about the politic of diasporic African people. She kind of was promoted also when we published in 2011, I think, the decolonial, we call it Decolonial Aesthetic Manifesto at that time, that you can find it in the web. But then that came into Decolonial Thesis, that in 2013, we all published a volume of social text Periscope, in where we talk all about that, and there is a lot of contributors. And a lot of those contributors were in Bebop. So that's kind of a small example. There are many, many examples around the world, and that is something else I want to add, but it is something else very going on in what we call cultural de-Westernization. Cultural de-Westernization, I mean, you can take, I give you two examples of cultural de-Westernization. One is the Sharjah Biennale 11, curated by Yuko Asegawa. And when you see what she did and said, she said, I would like to organize a biennale that kind of close this kind of Westernism, Eurocentrism, and all those kind of is. She invited two artists from United States, 20 from Europe, and 80 from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And the second I will say that to people. And in relation to that, you can see also the effort for re-Westernizing aesthetics. And that is Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour, I mean, it's so explicit, reset modernity. I mean, she's telling you, I don't want to let modernity out of my hand. We want to reset it. And there is a fantastic dialogue between Asegawa and Bruno Latour. Right? So this is a sphere of knowledge and humanity, because it has to do with humanity. The genius was always a human being, not a primitive or a barbarian. They do things that they offer. So this is a huge sphere that we inherited, but we cannot just take it as it was. So I stop there.
Thank you, Professor. Now I would like to introduce our member, Sindre Bangstad. He's a social anthropologist and a research professor at the Institute of Church, Religion and Worldview Research in Oslo. Please, Sindre.
Thank you very much, Mamita, and thank you very much, Professor Mignolo. We really appreciate you taking this time and making this effort to engage in this exchange. Now, I'll try to be brief because there are any number of questions. So my question goes as follows. Our last guest in this series was Professor Shilembembe, whom I believe you know reasonably well from Duke and from South Africa. Now, Achille should arguably be placed in a post-colonial rather than a decolonial canon. And in his forthcoming monograph, Out of the Dark Night, Essays on Decolonization, which is forthcoming early next year from Columbia University Press, Mbembe cautions against what he regards as a tendency within decolonial theory to quote unquote, theorize multiplicity as difference and to tether difference to act of, quote unquote, disconnection and separation. Now, in your co-authored volume on decoloniality, which we've discussed today, you argue that decolonization mutated into decoloniality, and you conceptualize decoloniality as delinking. And furthermore, you define decoloniality as being focused on epistemology rather than the state. So I think this raises the broader question as to whether you can explicate on what is at stake in the difference between a post-colonial and a decolonial position here.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah, I don't know exactly what Achille meant by the quote you gave, but I would say first that Achille has the right to his own opinion. So that's fine. I mean, I don't want to dispute what he thinks. If he thinks like that, well, good. He thinks like that. So I will tell you what I think about the question of multiplicity, disconnection, and separation. The way and I see it, multiplicity, disconnection, and separation is precisely what the rhetoric of modernity did. And to understand that, we have two concepts: the colonial and imperial differences. That is, but the most obvious example of separation that modernity produced has been separating human beings from life, and they invented the concept of nature. Think about the barbarity of the concept of nature. They reduced to one noun, object. And then when the Industrial Revolution came, they transformed nature in natural resources. And now we are human resources. So separation is what we have to fight against. So to fight against the colonial and an imperial differences. And that is why we are working coalition, pluriversality and coalition. I don't want to unite with modernity. Let me give you an example here. That is my guy. In the Owosso, during the Owosso, I don't know if Achille is thinking about this, what I'm going to say. In the war on Owosso, Kosovo, Bill Clinton pronounced a memorable sentence. We shall forget our difference and concentrate on our commonality of human being, like him. That is the Western concept. We have the concept of the human. We have to be human. Just forget about that you are Muslim, you are Sunni, you are Shia, you are Protestant, you are communist. No, we have to be all human, as far as I control. But I prefer the Zapatistas' dictum. Because we are all equal, we have the right at the difference. And then we respect difference in pluriversality and we look for coalition. But we reject the modern Western way of separating. And we know, divide and govern and control. We know the dictum, yeah? So the question from the decolonial, the way we practice, is this. Separation and disconnection is what modernity did. I don't want to reconnect with people who defend modernity, but they want to establish coalition with people who are building something else. So the decolonial and the post-colonial, Well, I cannot talk. I cannot talk for the post-colonial. I mean, they have their own way. But the way I see it, the easy way to understand the difference is to look at the genealogy of thought that form the decolonial and the post-colonial. So there is no post-colonial before 1980. Why? Because Lyotard published the postmodern condition, and then we saw the post-colonial. So the post-colonial piggyback, it's a piggybacking of postmodernity, and is maintained the post. Secondly, the post-colonial are built in four European dissident thinkers. You have Derrida, Spivak, Fanon, Baba, Foucault, Said, and Gramsci, Guha. And that is good. I mean, I think that the post-colonial introduced something very important, which is to introduce the colonial histories into the history of Europe, the history of modernity and postmodernity. When you read Foucault, when you read Rancière, they don't go beyond 1650, and they don't go beyond the south of the Mediterranean or the west of Romania, and not much north. When the north is kind of getting close to the Slavic and Orthodox section, that is the kind of the postmodern. So the distribution of the sensible that you were talking about, Maumita, before, is the distribution of the sensible within the sphere of Eurocentrism, and that's fine. But that doesn't have anything to do with me. They have the right to do it. I won't dispute that. But I have other soup to cook. So the decolonial goes back to Bandung Conference, 1955. The Bandung Conference is the most visible institutional moment of decolonization. So there are a lot of things were happening in Asia and Africa, but I mean the Bandung Conference concentrated. And there is a sentence by Sukarno that you can find it in the web. This is the first intercontinental conference of colored people. And he repeats, colored people. And then he starts talking about different religion, but there is no Christian there. So the Bandung Conference has three powerful legacies. One was the kind of the decolonization as was discussed during the Cold War by Fanon, by Césaire, by Lumumba, by Senghor, by all these people, right? But Biko. That is related to Bandung. But Bandung was a state project. So Bandung is also the seed of de-Westernization. Lee Kuan Yew was too young and Singapore was not yet a state, but Lee Kuan Yew was old enough and close enough to know what was going on. So when he became Prime Minister of Singapore, what happened? Singapore is an economic success, and at the same time, I mean, there is a lot of discourse by Lee Kuan Yew where he just kind of rejects the kind of dogma of the West. And there is also information that when Mao died, Deng Xiaoping wanted to talk to Lee Kuan Yew. So then you have the line of de-Westernization that comes from Bandung to the north. And then the third legacy is the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement is very important, but it took away something very important from Bandung. The non-aligned conference, the non-aligned movement kind of eliminated races. and became more of a kind of dissident between liberalism and communism within the kind of the Western nation state. So Tito and Nasser, and you know, guys from India, Nehru, Nehru was a kind of, I mean, and Nehru destituted Gandhi. I mean, Gandhi was killed, but all the teaching of Gandhi was destituted by Nehru. So that is the large frame of kind of the difference. I mean, from the decolonial, we have from the very beginning, from the Bandung conference, but also Fanon, kind of the riches of the earth was not just the Argelia, the riches of the earth were all over, and coloniality. Quijano provide a perspective of the global order from the South American Andes. So those are the differences, and I don't think that one is better than the other. I am not spend much time critiquing post-colonial. I think that they are doing their job, and that is very important. But we have our own things to advance, and not to waste time critiquing our friends, right? I mean, we have enemies. We don't. We have enemies. I mean, Trump or Kissinger. Those are the enemies, but not the post-colonial, right? The post-colonial may be a family feud. I mean, we can have some discussion over dinner, but I mean, not to spend time making a big fuss, because that is the problem of modern and postmodern intellectual. Wasting time trying to assert the truth by dismantling or devaluing something that has to be, there's no reason to devalue, because they are walking in the same direction, following different paths. But everybody, no, come to my path. Your path is kind of not the right one. That is not pluriversal. That is trying to maintain the universal decolonial. And we have people like that. We have people who the content is decolonial, but the attitude is a modern ego subject that have changed the content. Now they talk about decolonial instead of kind of the revolution of the proletariat. So that, I mean, there is more to talk, but just to give you some sense, Cinder, of the two maps of the decolonial and the postcolonial.
Thank you very much, Professor Mignolo. Before I leave the floor to Mumita again, who will do some of the many questions we've received through chat, I wanted just to share with you the sense of desperation there was when we noticed earlier on that you needed to reconnect your personal computer. So there was a comment from today's funniest from a certain Mashtura, who says, "Sorry, I think Walter's battery is running low. Can somebody tell him to charge his PC? Otherwise, he's going to send us all into the dark ages as he speaks about modernity." Now over to you, Mumita. Thank you very much, Walter.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Walter. I'm going to we have received a lot of questions, but there are some common themes. So I'm just going to read out maybe two that sort of speak to a common theme. This is a question from Martin Mejia. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. But he asks, is it not dangerous to dedicate too much effort to the reconstitution of tradition? Was not this the mistake of Heidegger, which inspired fascism? Or do you consider that certain contingency is necessary to break the thread before moving forward with the nation construction as Fanon aimed? And a follow-up question, which is similar from an anonymous attendee, says that a number of right-wing groups use the arguments of decoloniality, particularly to reconstitute traditions, to try and establish new hegemonic narratives that are very exclusionary, violent, and not interested in coalitions. How to guard against and argue with this kind of relativism?
Whoa. We are not trying to reconstitute traditions. Don't use tradition, because when you use tradition, you fall in the trap of the meaning of modernity. Tradition is a modern concept. Modernity needs the concept of tradition to justify itself as modern, right? So we don't reconstitute tradition, we reconstitute the destituted that is relevant to the decolonial conception we have today. So that is, I would just say, I just would say that. I mean, for example, take COVID. All kind of non-Western medicine were destituted. And now, and I have friends, indigenous friends, that they are taking care of their community, the people infected by COVID, with a kind of lot of infusion that they have been using for years. And apparently, with this kind of infusion and different kind of herbs that you have to kind of put boiling water and put the herbs and breathe for many minutes, that kind of herbs, many times a day. Well, it seems that many people have been cured from COVID, and the people who were taken to the hospital, many of them die. So this is the kind of restitution we want. We don't want to restitute fundamentalism. So, for example, the Al-Jabri, a kind of Moroccan philosopher, he had a book of critique of the Arab reason. And the critique of the Arab reason, a very monumental work, a very complex argument, but in a nutshell is this, that a Muslim intellectual have two problems now with fundamentalism. The Muslim fundamentalists and the Western fundamentalists. So they don't want to reconstitute Western fundamentalism, but they want to reconstitute arguments made by Ibn Rushd, by Al-Ghazali, by Ibn Sina. They were kind of the great philosophers that were destituted because Plato and Aristotle were the only great philosophers. So the question is, what we don't like to restitute different form of oppression. We don't like to restitute Inca civilization because they were oppressive in some way. But there are kind of knowledge that come from the Aymaras and Tiwanaku before the Inca. For example, this is one. There is a way of reorganizing governance that we would like to restitute. And that the Zapatistas gave one example, to rule and obey at the same time. No one who rules cannot obey. So tell that to Trump and see what he would be his response. We want to restitute the communal way of governance, not the pyramidal way of governance, right? We want to restitute knowledge that has been so, for example, the political theory of the Zapatistas, to rule and obey at the same time, is a kind of, that has been destituted, and we have to reconstitute that because democracy doesn't work. Democracy, as Gandhi said about civilization, is a good idea, but there's a lot of problem with democracy, and one of the main problems is constitutive of the nation state. And the nation state is a big problem because the nation state favor national but not human being. So, and that's what we have, the Holocaust, and we have the problem of migration in Europe, and the problem of the refugee because of the nation state. We want to reconstitute other form of governance. So that is the way I would respond to the first question, and that kind of goes to the second. I don't want to make coalition with people. I don't want a coalition with ISIS, right? But there are two forms of reconstitution now that they want to make coalition, but at the same time, I understand what is going on. we have places like China, Russia, Iran, and I think India too, and also Turkey. There is a lot of problem there, but they are not talking. Say we are not nation state. We are civilization state. So they want to reconstitute the civilization, and I cannot say that. No, you know, when Erdogan was elected for the second time, it seems that if you are talking about China or about Iran or Turkey, you have to be critical. You cannot try to understand what's going on, because if you're trying to understand what's going on, you are in favor. So the modern logic is either or, and the decolonial logic is neither A nor B, but exactly the opposite. We don't want to be trapped into dichotomy. So the reconstitution of the civilization state makes sense within the westernization. Erdogan, the second election, didn't go to visit the tomb of Ataturk first. They went to visit Suleiman the Magnificent. So they want to reconstitute the caliphate. And you can say, well, if the West wants to kind of maintain the nation state because it's convenient for them, why not the reconstitution of ancient, Chinese civilization? So it's not to say that this is the solution, but you cannot say that that is wrong at the same time that you maintain privilege of the West. It's not a question of either. This is a kind of but you know, there is a about the coalition and the kind of the fundamentalists. There is a very important book by Salman Saeed, Recalling the Caliphate. And that book, published about 4 or 5 years ago, said, "Oh, Recalling the Caliphate, ISIS." No, but Recalling the Caliphate has a subtitle, which is kind of Decolonial Reconstitution or something like that. So this is a decolonial take in the sense that he said, well, the Muslims at this moment are all kind of scattered and enclosed in nation states. You have Muslim in Iran, you have Muslim in Malaysia, you have Muslim in Turkey, you have Muslim all over, but we don't have, like the Christian, a papacy. We don't have a respected place like the papacy that congregate over the nations, all the Christian. So the question is investigation, to think about. Don't fall into either A or B, and don't fall into easy critical formulas. This is a time we have to run away from the social media. We have to run away from feeling that our intuition is the great truth that is just belong to me and I will criticize everybody. This is a time of conversation, of investigation, of exchanging. We are in a change of epoch, no longer an epoch of change. We cannot think the world now and in the coming years with the categories that we had 20 years ago. So our knowing, emoting, sensing, we have to be aware that that is changing, but we have to contribute to that change. And the decolonial is not the magic formula, it's one way to do it. That simple.
Thank you. There is another set of questions that's coming up, which is about the place of the university and academia. I'm going to read the question from Eduardo Rivera Picardo, who writes, could you elaborate on the topic of epistemic violence? Is it possible to conduct contextualized empirical work driven from decolonial inquiries? I'm going to read another question now from Blanca Caldas Chumbes. I'm really sorry about butchering your name. She asks, there are many scholars working towards decolonization of academia. Given that universities are one of the primary sources of hegemonic colonial thought, how do you see this endeavor?
Okay, so the university. So for us, epistemic, the violence is coloniality of knowledge, is the destitution of knowledge. We don't use that. I mean, we don't. I don't deny epistemic violence, but that epistemic violence is not within our conceptual frame. Epistemic destitution is violent, of course, but kind of epistemic the constitution destitution is one of the way of destitution. I mean, a destitution of the economy, a destitution from humanity, a destitution of governance, etc., etc. So you can say that all of that is knowledge, but this knowledge that is manifested in different kind of destitution. So what was the first question have a second part? Can you read the second part?
Yes, the second part is it possible to conduct contextualized empirical work driven from decolonial inquiries?
Contextualize empirical work. Okay.
I suppose he means ethnography or, this kind
No,
of.
no, that's that. Yeah, I think that's it. But thank you, because that allowed me to say something very important. Very important, not in general, very important for decolonial, the way we do it. This is a crucial point, a crucial issue. Shifting the geography of reasoning. What do I mean by that? Let me put it that way. I mentioned before, we are not using the colonial measure of power to apply to empirical, contextualize. Let me start with an example that's more familiar. When Sigmund Freud, or Lacan, or any kind of psychoanalyst, but let's say Sigmund Freud, that have a lot of narratives about this, and and he started the whole kind of ball game. He tell a lot of stories about the people who analyze, I don't know what, I mean, not the patient, but I mean the people who went to tell him stories about the problem, right? So he was listening to empirical narratives, and each narrative is different, right? No, millions of narratives he could have heard, none of them were similar. So he had to pay attention to that empirical narrative. But he was paying attention to something else, not the narrative, not what he was hearing or he or she was telling him. He was not paying attention to, he was paying attention to the said, but more so, he was paying attention to the saying. So he had double attention. He said, what this person is telling me, and second, said, how is the unconscious working here? And what this narrative is telling me about the unconscious. Right? So Freud was not just interested in that narrative, he was interested because the narrative was telling something about the unconscious, how the unconscious work. So when we do pay attention to empirical research, or I do empirical research, I am not interested on the empirical research, is what this is telling me about how the colonial measure of power works. That is the shifting, tremendous importance, because modernity block us, prevent us to ask about the enunciation. And because they prevent us to ask about the enunciation, they block the enunciation and they say our enunciation is universal. give me a break. So they were able to pretend their universalities because they block the enunciation. And that is what we are interested in. But we cannot, Freud cannot go to the unconscious just kind of by looking at the brain. Oh. By looking at the brain, he has to kind of access the unconscious through the story. And we cannot just look at the colonial method of power by what? Doing research in the lab. But what do? I mean, we need empirical information or research or narrative, whatever, to access that. So that is the main politics of decolonial investigation. To understand how the colonial method of power, whatever way you are able to make. I mean, I was trained as a semiotician, so I look for signs. If you are trained as a sociologist, you will look for statistics. If you are looking for an economist, also. I mean, you are a decolonial training in economics, you will see different things that I do. And if you are a psychologist trained in decolonial, you will see different things. Because, and I close with this, about the contextualizing and the empirical in relation to that. We don't see what there is. We see what we see. And we see what has been programmed to see. So that is why the enunciation of coloniality, but also our enunciation is. So that is also the shifting. There is no reality. Reality and objectivity are argument to convince you. When somebody tells you, come on, be real, what does he or she mean? Be like me. Come on, be objective. What does it mean? See things as I see it. That is objectivity, not the way you see it. So that is another big chunk of issues that we have to think. And that is a kind of theoretical and empirical at the same way, because we cannot just say these kind of things without going through empirical information or empirical data. So university, that's my favorite because I work at a university. And so it's a kind of the daily, I would say two things here, or three. So, you know, the university was created in the Middle Age, right? In Europe, Bologna, and then Coimbra, and Salamanca, Paris, etc., etc. And what was a university? It was a kind of high research institution. I mean, teaching and research institution. The Incas had something called Yachayhuasi. It was exactly the same. But then came the Spanish and said, well, Yachayhuasi out the university. So one of the first universities in the New World was that in Peru. The first was Santo Domingo, and then Mexico, and then Argentina, and the newest was Harvard, 1636. And so, but everybody, I mean, madrasa, you have madrasa in India, so every civilization have their own kind of institution of higher civilization. So the European they need it, and they have the right to have their own. I don't remember the name, but I mean, there was a higher institution of in Arab, but also Muslim Arab, and in the Muslim world there were kind of high institution. Otherwise, cannot be great thinker like Al-Ghazali if there is no way of kind of reading the Greeks and transforming the Greeks. Huh? So the university is the European way of having their own kind of institution, and they have the right to do it. Why not? If everybody else already had it, why not the European, right? So the second point is that during the Renaissance, the university has changed the curriculum, but the biggest change is the export. They began to export the university to the New World. And In the 19th century, the university began to be exported to different parts of the world. Right? So China, the first university in China is 1905, the University of Peking. But you cannot say that the Chinese were kind of barbarian and they didn't think because they didn't have university. Right? The university destituted the kind of institution of higher education that Chinese have for 3,000 years. So Aristotle and Plato kind of, Mencius and Confucius go out, so there is and the same story later on is about museum. So museum and university are fundamental institutions of the constitution of the colonial measure of power, of the constitution of Western knowledge and sensing and emoting, and destituting other ways of knowing, right? And now, 1920, we are in a very interesting situation. Because at some point, until recent, the question was, the Western University was constituted and everybody from the rest of the world want to go to Europe and United States. What happened in the past 10 or 15 years? Well, Northwestern New York have university in Doha, in Abu Dhabi, Harvard in Singapore, Duke in Kunshan, China. What is going on here? Oh, you see, it's a kind of the benefactor, the best benefactor, want to just put university in those places where there are a lot of people, barbarian people who have to learn Western knowledge. So the question is, interesting is what is the politics of the local? Chinese are not, Chinese are interested in Western knowledge, not to become Western, but to reject Western or to incorporate Western. So then you have all the kind of the problem of the technological war, that China is stealing knowledge from the West. Perhaps they do, and that's so what, because the West constitutes itself, but they're stealing knowledge from China, from the Arab world, etc., 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 and not recognizing them. Yeah? So that is a big chunk of the history of the university, that we have the politics of decolonial investigation. These are the kind of issues that we have to kind of tell. Now, the second point is, what do we do now? What do we do now is two things. Those of us who work at the university or, let's say, museum or mass media, etc. I just talk about the university, but I want to just open up the field. The university is using me and you and whoever. Graduate student, we have to recognize that. They pay me a salary. They kind of facilitate my research at the exchange of my labor. So I will say that they are exploiting my labor, but they're kind of using my labor, right? For their purpose. I know that. So the question now is, how can I use the university to my purpose? So there is no way that we can go to the dean and the provost and the vice provost and say, hey, come on, we have a fantastic idea to transform and decolonize education. So you know what they will tell us, no? No, they have other problems. They have to train people for the modern world. They let us inside because we are part of the humanities and the liberal education. So we have to use that. So we use that space. There are hundreds and hundreds, not hundreds, but 100, we are many. So there are hundreds of students going through our seminars. and doing research with us. So that is the way we have to use the institution, use the museum, use etc. And at the same time, we have to, the university cannot be decolonized in the same way that the state cannot be decolonized. You can do decolonial work at the university. You can do the colonial work at the museum. If you are lucky, you can do the colonial work at CNN, but you cannot decolonize CNN. Right? So, kind of, you can do decolonial work in the curriculum, but you cannot decolonize the curriculum. So that is the way that we are used, but at the same time we have to use. We have to know our limits. We cannot kind of think that our ideas are great and everybody will accept it, even the president of the university or the president of the United States. So use the university also to do the colonial investigation. Facilitate what the university give us to do our research, but to do our research, the investigation in relation to our question, not the question that the discipline. We have to be not interdisciplinary, we have to be undisciplinary. So we have to kind of disobey the discipline. At the same time, we have to obey certain rule of research and argumentation, otherwise nobody will listen to us. When I wrote The Darker Side of Renaissance, it's because I already knew that. I mean, I was not trained in history. I was not trained in cartography. I was trained in semiotics, so I knew something about the politics of languages. But I wrote 2 chapters in history memory and 2 chapters in cartography, not because I was trained on that, but because I have my own question. And cartography was useful for me, and history was useful for me to kind of formulate the darker side of the Renaissance. So that is a lot of work to do. Not, I mean, for future generation. And I think one of the talking about the future body, one of our job is not to expect that next year the colonial will kind of transform the world. You cannot transform the world if people who are in the world are not transformed. So that is the kind of the problem with Marx. He had good intention, but he wanted to transform the world as he thought he should be transformed. Well, no, transforming the world is people working together in coalition and pluriversality. So the question is, the seed we have been planting already, because this is not beginning. I mean, began about 50, 60 years ago. The seeds we have been planting for future generation. Your generation, young people, and your sons and your grandchildren. So that is what for me is fascinating. Not that we will have that Biden will solve the problem. No, that is not. So, but the question is, we have to vote, unfortunately, but we cannot expect much for, as somebody said, democracy allow us to vote and to elect the people who will, the next people that will oppress us. So that's kind of definition, a decolonial definition of democracy. Well, okay, that is for kind of university.
Thank you so much, Professor Mignolo. Unfortunately, we are really out of time today, but we have some 40 questions, which are fascinating. You've answered a lot of them.
So, but I wonder if the question that has been asked has been copied.
Yes, so I was just going to say that. So I will make sure that you have all the questions. And if you wish to answer any of them, then we can put it on all our channels where our attendees are watching so they can, get your answers. Yes.
I tell you why.
Yes.
The part of the colonial investigation is because I am egotistic. I do these kind of things because I am learning. It's through the questions that I can keep on thinking. That is why I like to teach, because it's through the question of the student, with the participation of the student. He said, oh, that is what the new generation is thinking. So I have to think more about that. So yeah, thank you for sending me, and thank you everybody who has been who have been kind of listening.
But before we let you go and thank you, I have to advertise our next event, which is a panel on the question of the decolonial in anthropology with Professor Kamari Clark of UCLA and Dr. Ryan Jobson of University of Chicago. So please join us on the 28th of January. And
oh, they will be. Oh yeah, send me the link. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
lovely, lovely.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Professor Mignolo. This was so good for us. I don't know where the time flew. So
But I mean, that is my job. I mean, it's I'm saying. I mean, a kind of egotistics. I don't do that because all the money you gave me.
we'd like to say we've given nothing. But we will give you 200 questions.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, for
Bye-bye.
participating. Thank you.
Yeah.